So without any further ado, Tommy and Jane, are you all ready?
Yep.
All right, we'll take it away.
Hi and welcome everyone. My name is Tommy Hooper. I'm a fire technician in Banff National Park. And with me I have Jane Park, who is the fire and vegetation specialist here in Banff as well. I'd first like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that Banff National Park is within the present day territories of the Treaty 6, 7, and 8, as well as the Métis homeland. The lands and waters of Banff have been used for millennia by Indigenous peoples for sustenance, ceremony, trade, and travel. We thank them for their continuous stewardship and for sharing the land with us. So to start, just giving a brief overview, we'll go over briefly the Banff National Park fire regime, overview of the fire management program. We'll go through our virtual field trip through the Sawback, Flintstony, and the Fairholme prescribed fires. We'll give a brief overview of our communications and stakeholder engagement, along with Indigenous cultural burning practices, a quick conclusion followed by our question and answers that we hope to have. So Banff National Park was the first national park in Canada, and it was established in 1885. It was the second national park created in North America after Yellowstone and third in the world. It is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site in combination with 3 other national parks and 3 provincial parks. The area of Banff National Park is 1.64 million acres, which converts to 0.66 million hectares, which is quite a large area. As you can see, we've got Jasper to the north, arrow pointing to Banff, Yoho, and Kootenay National Parks, all adjacent to Banff National Park.
So I'll just briefly go over what the historic fire regime is in the areas that we'll be kind of taking you guys on a tour of. And the first, we've got obviously a lot of elevational differences in the Rocky Mountains here in Canada. In our area, we're on the eastern slopes in Alberta, and at the lower elevations in the Montane, it's kind of a spring and summer fire regime, largely fueled, like many fires in North America, by Indigenous cultural burning. A lot of our fire history studies have shown in periods where there are no lightning occurrences, typically in the spring and the fall, that there were many frequent low intensity and low severity fires in these valley bottoms. And through other traditional knowledge studies and interviews, they've determined that a lot of this cultural burning was done for ceremony, but also to maintain travel routes and habitat for prey species and medicinal plants. As you move up the mountains, we get into more of a subalpine ecoregion. Those forests are typified by summer lightning caused fires that are mixed to high severity. So a lot of stand replacing fires. Those fires in those higher elevations are relatively infrequent, anywhere from 100 to several hundred-year fire cycles. Next point. But obviously, similar to a lot of places all over the world, Banff National Park was also subject to fire exclusion. The fire exclusion was based primarily on kind of the development of the area, but also in the extirpation of the Indigenous people from the area in the park. And with the relocation of most of the nations that shared this land here prior to the park, they were moved outside of the park. And with that, their cultural burning practices also moved. Because of those fire exclusionary policies, the forests have become dense and overgrown. There's been a decrease in biodiversity, both in the vegetation and the wildlife. Many of them are degraded ecosystems in terms of high instances of forest insects and disease and increased risk for severe wildfires. Next slide. So this graph just kind of shows you, what the fire area burned was like just at the kind of turn of the century when the park was first established. You can still see a number of fires occurring, anywhere from the beginning of the 1900s into the 40s. Most of these were railway fires as the railway went through the park, and then a few wildfires. Then you barely see any fires through the 40s through the 60s until about 1968 and 1974, where you see some wildfires. And some of those wildfires really triggered a lot of research within Parks Canada to look at fire ecology and succession post-fire and impacts of the fire on the ecosystem, and an acknowledgement that fire was a restorative process on the landscape that needed to be restored. So in 1983, the first prescribed fire in Banff National Park was conducted, just a small 6 hectares. And the program has grown significantly since then, with people like my predecessor, Ian Pengelly, implementing large landscape level stand replacing fires. And then since then, we've been able to take advantage of a lot of that and do some iterative prescribed fires on the same locations to convert some of the vegetation back to the historic range of variability and what you would typically see in the montane, which were a lot of more open Douglas fir and aspen grasslands. Next slide. And so this next slide, we're just going to show you just a really quick video. It just references, how Banff National Park and Parks Canada is using prescribed fire in terms of resilience to climate change. And so I thought a video might be nicer than us chatting about PowerPoint.
Climate change is here. We can see it, we can smell it. Large catastrophic wildfires have caused significant impacts on communities across North America. Climate modeling predicts fire seasons will become longer, there will be more drought, and fires will be more severe and larger in the coming years. For over a century, our approach was to suppress all wildfires, resulting in forests that are dense and overgrown, like matchsticks, ready to ignite. Because of this, Banff National Park and its communities are not immune to the threats of climate change and natural wildfires. One way Parks Canada is creating more climate change resilient landscapes is through prescribed fire. Banff National Park was the first Canadian national park to implement prescribed fire in 1983, long before the impacts of climate change were understood. We continue to use prescribed fire, managed wildfires, and fuel management to create ecosystems that can better withstand the impacts of climate change on future wildfires. By creating diverse forests and open grassland habitats with tree species like Douglas fir and aspen, we can create landscapes that are more resilient to insects, disease, drought, wildfire, and climate change. By furthering our understanding of fire in our ecosystems, we can continue to adapt to our changing climate, ultimately protecting Banff National Park, its communities, and the wildlife and vegetation who call this place home.
So this next slide shows a map of the prescribed burns in the areas that we're going to be visiting on our field trip. So you can see where Banff is in the middle there. We're going to travel a bit west over to the Sawback prescribed burn, which has had many iterations over the last 20 years or so. The last time we burned it was in 2014, and then we're going to fly up north up to the Flint Stony Meadows prescribed burn that we completed over the last 2 years. And then we'll fly down south down the Cascade Valley past Lake Minnewanka down to the Fairhill.
The Sawback Range is located 5 kilometers upwind of the town of Banff and historically is composed of aspen and Doug-fir grasslands, which are similar to elsewhere in the national park. There have been many iterations of prescribed fires over the years, and they not all necessarily overlapped. There have been 10 prescribed fires between 1984 and 1998, with a total of 1,870 hectares, with the most recent burn being in 2014. By 2014, a large amount of coarse-woody debris, pine and spruce regen, accumulated, making it difficult for wildlife to travel. Significant mortality of wolves and bears on the Highway 1A and the Canadian Pacific Railway resulted. The prescribed burn took place on a Friday of the Canadian Thanksgiving long weekend, which limited road closures as the Trans-Canada Highway stayed open the whole time. As a result, many tourists stopped to talk to the information officer with over 200 contacts. There were no negative comments once ecological objectives were explained. The prescribed burn was very visible from the Trans-Canada Highway, as it is also adjacent to the Highway 1A across the river. The burn was conducted with favorable wind direction to mitigate smoke and air quality effects in the town of Banff, despite it being 5 kilometers downwind. Some locals did not know that 700 hectares were burned that day. During the burn, air quality was measured at the Banff Warden Station. We also took advantage of good venting conditions through atmospheric instability, wind direction, and a lack of inversions. The incoming precipitation also reduced the periods of smoke. Another aspect of our smoke management plan is to inform our smoke-sensitive stakeholders through social media, newspapers, emails, and signage, with the use of our other communication staff as well. The prescribed fire was lit through aerial ignition as well as hand ignition using drip torches from some of the Parks Canada crews. The general goals outlined by the Banff Park Management Plan of 2010 and the Bow Valley Parkway Action Plan of 2012 are to improve wildlife habitat and vegetation species diversity within the Sawback Range and to maintain forest cover, structure, and function within the range of natural ability. The ecological objectives are to improve habitat quality for the establishment of whitebark pine, as well as to improve the quantity and the quality of grizzly bear habitat by reducing lodgepole pine regeneration, as well as reducing downwoody debris. Another ecological objective is to restore Douglas fir and aspen grasslands. It ended up snowing 2 days after the burn was complete, which minimized holdovers and mop-up requirements. Now, after many iterations of prescribed fire, we have successfully returned a large portion of this area to its historic fire regime, being frequent fire in Douglas fir grasslands for a 10 to 50 year fire cycle. Here you can see the West Sulphur Wildfire Risk Reduction Project, which is adjacent to the town of Banff, and how close that is to the Sawback prescribed burn of 2014. In this clip, you can see how close the Trans-Canada Highway, Highway 1A, and the Canadian Pacific Railway are to the burn unit, and why this prescribed burn was so important for wildlife, forest health due to mountain pine beetle, and protecting the town of Banff. Whitebark pine was planted after the fire, as whitebark pine is a species at risk and is considered endangered. Within the unit as well, there are other wolf dens and bear dens. As you can see, there is less coarse-woody debris opening up travel corridors for wildlife, with an increase in diversity of vegetation as well. The unit is split up into 4 distinct places, as you can see on the map here. The first burns in the Flint's Meadows took place in the fall of 1998, with 130 hectares burned, with subsequent burns in 1999 of 25 hectares, in 2000 where multiple meadows were burned with a total of 153 hectares. There were also more meadows burned in 2001 for a total of 488 hectares, and finally 35 hectares were burned in 2007, which is a similar burn to the one we did in the fall of 2021 that we'll see later here. The Fire and Vegetation Department all took turns coming out to help in the collection of fire effects monitoring, looking at some of the grassy slopes and also some of the areas where we have really thick regen. Fire effects monitoring protocols were developed to assess stand structure, the composition, fine and coarse-woody debris loading, grass clip plots, vegetation identification, canopy cover, and duff depth. Similar ecological objectives to the sawbuck and the fair home prescribed burns are trying to limit conifer regen maturing before coning and coarse-woody debris buildup, which limits wildlife's abilities to travel through the area. Additionally, objectives to maintain a higher grassland habitat for bighorn sheep and open up over-mature lodgepole pine for other montane species, such as elk, bears, and the newly reintroduced bison into Banff National Park. When we came back in the spring of 2021, there were already bighorn sheep and elk grazing on what was burned in the fall of 2020, because it had greened up early due to the albedo and the black ground along with the solar radiation. Additionally, as you can see, elk and bighorn sheep have moved into the area shortly after our fall 2021 meadow burn, which is exciting to see how wildlife moved back into an area after it's been burned. In the fall, bison are often attracted to areas that have burned in the spring due to the native fescue grasses that grow during the summer. Unfortunately, our bison have stayed further north thus far. The female elk are marked in yellow and the male elk are marked in blue. As you can see, they've already started to move in through the Flint Stony area, along with bighorn sheep, who have also started to move in through this area, as you can see here. With the newly acquired drones, we attempted to use them to identify hotspots for mop-up concerns, which is a fun and very useful technology that we'll be utilizing more of in the future. Seen here, the coarse-woody debris has developed significantly in areas where there has been no fire since 2007, making it difficult for wildlife to move through the area. There has also been conifer encroachment and dead grass accumulation, resulting in increased fuel loads within the meadows. This prescribed fire helped control the amount of conifer encroachment while also encouraging the regrowth of grasses and shrub species in these areas. We burned in the spring to take advantage of the higher duff moisture to promote native fescue grasslands. Burning in the spring during the spring dip aids in maintaining a low to moderate intensity surface fire. The spring dip is when the ground is still frozen, yet the vegetation is starting to use up the residual moisture stored within the plant, creating drought-like conditions. The frozen ground also aids in the protection of the soil horizons. This area shows that once a stand replacing prescribed fire has been completed, it's easy to get short one-day windows to do a fair bit of burning with minimal personnel. This part of the fire was completed in the fall of 2020. We completed the units with a combination of aerial ignition with an aerial ignition device dropping fireballs of potassium permanganate that are injected with glycol for the areas of larger amounts of coarse-woody debris and on the steeper slopes. We used drip torches for the valley bottom meadows. Burning of shrub meadows within the Flint's Meadows was completed to increase wildlife forage habitat, which is what we're doing here using strip ignition. Similarly, in the fall, after some fall moisture and curing, in our case there was a few centimeters of snow on this meadow 2 weeks prior to us burning. We were burning these meadows in the fall in an attempt to limit the amount of shrub regen in the spring and summer of 2022. The Flint's meadow burning being completed here amounted to about 36 hectares in total. This is the third meadow as part of our prescribed burn for that day. As you can see, it went quite well and amounted to about 32 hectares. At the end of October and start of November in the fall of 2021, the vegetation section of our department went out to the Stony Meadows burn units to plant whitebark pine in key areas that were selected as core habitat for survival due to the preferred slope aspect and lack of competition from lodgepole pine, spruce, and subalpine fir. As you can see here, one of our vegetation technicians is taking care to open up the roots of these whitebark pine seedlings. Is classified as an environmental sensitive site as it is the largest continuous area of montane ecoregion in Banff. This montane ecoregion is important for wildlife habitat and diversity, yet only comprises 2% of the area within Banff. The historic town of Bankhead is an old mining town which has coal seams throughout the Fairholme Bench, along with other archaeological artifacts that require protecting. Montane is super important for wildlife habitat and diversity, yet it only comprises 2% of the area within Banff. The wildlife found in the montane are grizzly bears, wolves, elk, and deer, with the historic vegetation of Douglas fir grasslands and aspen lands, as you can see here, which is overgrown with lodgepole pine. The prescribed burn is located in between the town of Banff to the west and the town of Canmore to the south. In the early 2000s, mountain pine beetle populations in British Columbia started to significantly increase. In Banff, mountain pine beetle is a native insect and a natural disturbance like wildfire. Banff has had mountain pine beetle increases almost every decade, but in the 2000s, there was so much overmature lodgepole pine, which contributed to significant tree mortality, increasing the danger of high severity fire within the Bow Valley. One major objective of the Fairholme was to reduce mountain pine beetle susceptible forests at the landscape scale adjacent to provincial working forests, along with increasing forest heterogeneity and resilience to mountain pine beetle and wildfire. We used a stand replacement fire to convert vegetation, converting dense conifer to an open montane forest. The Fairholme prescribed burn was also a major step in wildfire risk reduction for the town of Canmore and the hamlet of Harvey Heights, located to the east of the unit. The Carrot Creek fuel break, located at the east end of the unit along the national park boundary, was 300 hectares of mechanical thinning. We are starting to utilize drone technology to conduct reconnaissance in areas we want to have burned, to aid in the development of strategies and tactics, along with the ability to document these areas in a more financially responsible way. Two 2003 was a major fire year in Western Canada, with the Kamloops barrier fires and fires in Kootenay National Park. Parks Canada ignited the Fairholme in the spring of 2003, but it held over due to severe drought conditions in July and August, with over 40 days without rain and the ever-reliable June monsoon not happening. Many areas in the unit ended up reburning more severely in August. This prescribed burn was a huge feat to complete given its location adjacent to the Trans-Canada Highway, which is the main transportation corridor in Canada running east to west. There are huge impacts to the economy if the Trans-Canada Highway closes even for an hour. A prime example of this is the current flooding that's happening in British Columbia that is causing huge supply chain issues to get goods and services to and from the infected areas. This PB also had an extensive and detailed communications plan to ensure stakeholders were informed and highway smoke mitigation plans were in place. Also being directly adjacent to the towns of Canmore and Banff during the height of the tourist season also made it challenging. Smoke was a large management issue that required lots of communication with stakeholder notifications, meetings, and public notices. There is an important ecological need to maintain and restore this habitat as outlined in the Banff Park Management Plan. It is important grizzly bear and wolf habitat. As Charlie McClellan's master's research showed, one female grizzly bear's entire home range was the burned area on the Fairholme. Additionally, there was evidence that the Fairholme wolf pack would also stay on the burned side of the highway rather than go elsewhere. The Fairholme Bench is also important elk habitat and a transportation corridor in the fall as elk move back into the park for the winter. Due to the location and other lessons learned from 2003, the reburn will be conducted in the fall to limit the potential for smoke issues and holdover problems that happened throughout the summer of 2003. Consultation with stakeholders, surrounding municipalities, and input from Indigenous nations are some of the important steps we are taking within our communications plan. Some of the additional tools and tactics used in the communications plan will be public notices, prescribed burn status updates, smoke-sensitive notifications, a detailed highway traffic strategy and rail strategy, in-person visitor information, and in-person prescribed fire information using our fire communications trailer, which also helps to ensure public education and safety. As you can see, the lodgepole pine regen within the Fairholme is quite dense and is growing up quite quickly, making it difficult for wildlife to move and utilize this montane ecosystem. I would like to thank you for joining this virtual field trip of the landscape level fire restoration projects we have completed in Banff National Park.
Just quickly going over our communications and stakeholder engagement. Public perception support is paramount because without public and stakeholder support, we really wouldn't be able to pull off any of the prescribed burns that we do. We also have 4 million visitors per year, so education and outreach and public safety is extremely important. And there's also the need to consider smoke mitigations for major transportation corridors, such as the Transport Canada Highway and the Canadian Pacific Railway that I mentioned in the video. These smoke concerns are unlikely to go away in the coming years, so it's really important that we maintain our public trust and understanding around the benefits of prescribed burns.
One area that we are, as the federal government in Canada, trying to get more involved in is in the engagement of Indigenous nations that had their traditional territories within our national parks. In Banff, as we mentioned at the very beginning, Banff is situated in the traditional territories of the Treaty 6, 7, and 8 nations, as well as the Métis homeland. And Indigenous cultural burning is really going to be key to fire restoration and landscape resilience as we head into the future. I wanted to make the point that Indigenous cultural burning is different than the prescribed fire that we as Parks Canada do. It's done for a variety of reasons. And you know, a lot of the work that we do within Parks Canada is to kind of reverse some of the negative impacts of fire exclusion on the landscape at a large scale level. But there are many different reasons that Indigenous nations would have burned in historically. And the photo you see there on the right is of a Blackfoot man lighting grassland fire in the 1900s. It's a photo from the provincial archives. And, you know, we are engaging with and consulting directly with Indigenous nations as to how they want to interface with the fire management within the national parks. There are a number of parks within the mountains that are working directly with nations in terms of capacity building. And we're trying to, facilitate the reconnection with the land to the cultural burning practices. One of the projects that we're working on in Banff is working with the Métis Nation of Alberta on a Métis youth camp and workshop on cultural burning, to invite families and youth to one of our historic sites to talk about fire ecology, but also about their own nation's cultural burning practices. And the one real point I wanted to make also is that this is about, capacity building within nations, as well as knowledge sharing between us and the nations, and not that we want to appropriate the cultural burning and do it ourselves, but to work together to facilitate it happening within our national parks. And there are a number of programs we can look to all over the world that are way ahead of us in this regard, but we are actively working towards this goal in Banff as well. Next slide. So just in conclusion, as with many places in North America, we've had the alteration of our historic fire regime. Key to that is the removal of Indigenous burning. The fact that fire suppression has led to fuel buildups and decreased biodiversity, and that we are trying to restore fire through prescribed fire and manage wildfire to increase resilience to wildfire and climate change. And we're working with Indigenous nations to reintroduce cultural burning practices that are key to fire management in the park. And so we have time for questions if anybody's got any.
All right, well, thank you so much for that tour. Thank you for sharing the place that you get to work with us. And thank you all for joining us. My name is David Godwin, and I am the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida in the southeastern US. And we have about 7 minutes remaining in this session for this virtual field trip, and then we'll be moving to another one. So if you have questions for Jane or for Tommy about where they work, about the things that they've been working on with prescribed fire in the Banff region, please go ahead and put those in the chat window, and we will try and get to as many as we can in the time that we have remaining. Thank you for those videos. That was a fantastic and just a really cinematic tour of the places that you all get to work. It's coming from a different region that just is stunning and beautiful. While we wait to see if we have any questions, I was curious. It looked like you had a graph, a chart that you showed at the beginning of your presentation, depicting wildfires and prescribed fires in the region over time. And so I was curious, have you seen impacts from your prescribed fire program on the wildfires in the region?
Well, our fire regime here is really strongly kind of biased towards the anthropogenic part of the fire regime. We haven't had a ton of larger wildfires. However, we have had a number of large wildfires in adjoining parks in Kootenay National Park, as well as in Jasper and in northern Banff. And there definitely have been some, positive benefits to in some of the areas where they've burned into areas where we've burned before or adjacent to. But what we're also seeing, as many places are, with the current types of drought conditions that we're seeing, that even places that have burned fairly recently are burning just as well as places that hadn't burned. So I think the key there is the maintenance of these areas and kind of getting it back to that kind of lower intensity, lower severity fire regime.
So you talked a little bit about engaging with the public and some of the nearby communities, and how some of these prescribed fires were for fuel reduction purposes to protect some of the nearby towns. What kind of feedback have you had from the public about your programs?
Yeah, we've been pretty fortunate to have had quite a bit of social science done in the national park, and so we've definitely seen a shift, from from the 80s and 90s, when prescribed fire was definitely not supported. Some of the social science kind of showed that both residents and employees of Parks Canada weren't necessarily supportive of the program. But as we increase the amount of education and outreach to kind of improve the public's understanding of why we're doing this and how this is kind of proactive management, we get quite a bit of strong support. That opening slide that we had with the really big smoke column, you know, even though that was about 20 kilometers in the backcountry, you could see that smoke plume very clearly from the town of Canmore. And Canmore is about, I don't know, I think it's 10 or 15,000 people, with many, many visitors from Calgary. And despite being able to see the column quite well, because we had communicated what we were doing, most of the feedback on social media was really positive, giving us kudos for doing that. Even though at the same time there was a wildfire burning right adjacent to the park that was actually creating quite a bit of fear for people. It was interesting to see the comments about our prescribed fire and that they were generally positive.
That's really encouraging. So I'm curious to hear what are you able to burn as much as you would like to burn as a program within your region? And if not, what are some of the challenges that that are holding your program back from what you'd like to achieve?
Yeah, well, our target locally here is 1,400 hectares per year. That only represents 50% of the historic fire cycle. And, you know, in some years we can achieve that. I think it is getting more and more challenging, not necessarily because we don't have the weather windows, which is what a lot of people think, but, you know, we're a fairly small program. And, you know, in Canada, as you've seen in the last few years, we've had very large fire seasons. And a number of years, our larger landscape fires have been kind of put on hold in terms of all of us having to respond to the wildfire situations in adjacent agencies or within our own agency. And so it really puts a strain on the resources that we have available, and the comfort level of managers and the public for us to do prescribed fire when there are large kind of interface wildfires going on elsewhere. So that's definitely a challenge, and obviously weather's always a challenge, but I think that you know, largely like the public and the management support is there. It's just difficult with, especially with climate change, with the fire seasons going the way they are. It's just harder and harder to do our stuff at the same time as responding to wildfires.
All right, well, unless there are any other questions that come in right now on the chat, I think we're going to wrap up and move on to our next field trip. So if we were all together in the field or in the room, I would say let's give you all one big round of applause and say thank you so much for sharing the place that you get to work and the kinds of things that you guys have been doing in that region. Beautiful videos and great work, and we hope that if we can all visit, I'm sure, in person someday. And until next time, I hope you'll be able to bring another virtual field trip to one of our next conferences. So thank you again so much.